No one will save you. Stoic mindset for personal power. There is a quiet lie that follows most people through life. It rarely arrives loudly. It does not appear as a clear sentence in your mind. Instead, it hides inside small hopes and silent expectations that grow stronger over the years. The belief that one day something will finally arrive to fix everything. That one day the right opportunity will appear. That someone wiser will show you exactly what to do. That circumstances will stabilize and life will finally feel manageable. So people wait. They wait for the right moment to become disciplined. They wait for motivation to appear before they act. They wait for the world to calm down before they calm their own minds. And during that waiting, something subtle begins to happen. Anxiety grows. The future becomes a constant source of tension because it feels like your peace is stored somewhere inside it. Every unknown outcome becomes a threat. Every uncertainty becomes a question that refuses to leave your mind. What if things go wrong? What if I fail? What if people turn against me? What if the life I imagined never arrives? These thoughts quietly shape how you live. You begin to believe that peace will come later, after success, after approval, after life finally becomes predictable. But life rarely offers that kind of contract. Plans collapse without warning. People act according to their own interests. Effort does not always produce immediate reward, and the future refuses to explain itself in advance. Slowly, the realization begins to emerge, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet understanding that appears after enough disappointments accumulate. No one is coming to save you. At first, this thought feels almost cruel. It sounds like abandonment. It sounds like the world has closed its doors. But the Stoic philosophers understood something most people miss in that sentence. They saw that the expectation of rescue is one of the most dangerous illusions a person can carry. Because the moment your peace depends on someone else appearing with answers, your life becomes a waiting room. Your confidence waits for approval. Your discipline waits for motivation. Your courage waits for reassurance. And while you wait, the world continues moving without asking whether you feel ready. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius lived surrounded by chaos. Wars threatened the borders of the empire. Plagues moved through cities. Betrayal existed even inside his own circle of allies. Yet he wrote something to himself that reveals a different way to face life. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, Paragraph 1, he reminds himself that the disturbance of the mind does not come from events themselves, but from the judgments we attach to them. That sentence changes the direction of responsibility. It does not promise a peaceful world. It promises something more powerful. The possibility of a peaceful mind inside an unpredictable world. Think carefully about what that means. If your disturbance comes from judgment, then judgment belongs to you. If judgment belongs to you, then your inner stability does not depend on the cooperation of the world. This is the moment where Stoic philosophy stops being an abstract idea and becomes a practical tool for survival. Because the Stoics never promised a comfortable life. They promised something more valuable. Clarity. Clarity about what belongs to you and what does not. Clarity about what deserves your energy and what deserves your indifference. Clarity about how a human being can remain steady while everything around them changes. But clarity requires the courage to abandon illusions, and one illusion must collapse before any real strength can appear. The illusion that life will eventually organize itself in a way that protects your emotions. The Stoics understood that life does not protect anyone from difficulty. It does not guarantee fairness. It does not promise that good intentions will always be recognized, but it does offer something else. Every difficulty becomes a test of character. Every uncertainty becomes a chance to practice judgment. Every challenge becomes material for strengthening the mind. Once you begin to see life this way, the role you play in your own story changes completely. You stop asking when the world will finally become easier. You begin asking a far more powerful question. What part of this situation belongs to me? Because once you discover the answer to that question, something inside you becomes impossible to enslave. But before that strength can fully emerge, another hidden problem must be exposed. A silent agreement most people believe the world has signed with them. An agreement that reality never actually accepted. There is a moment in life that arrives quietly but changes everything. It does not come with celebration. It does not feel like progress. Most people experience it as confusion, frustration, or even bitterness. It is the moment when the comforting story you believed about life begins to crack. For years you carry a certain expectation about how the world works. You believe effort will always lead to reward. You believe sincerity will be recognized. You believe fairness is the natural order of things. These ideas shape how you move through life. They give structure to your decisions. They give meaning to your patience. You tell yourself that if you keep doing the right things, life will eventually respond in the right way. But reality does not follow that script. You work hard, and someone else receives the opportunity. You offer loyalty and receive indifference. You prepare carefully, and circumstances change without warning. At first, you resist the conclusion. You tell yourself the problem is temporary. You assume that sooner or later the world will correct itself and reward your patience. But slowly a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Life does not organize itself around personal expectation. The world is not arranged to satisfy your plans, protect your emotions, or confirm your sense of fairness. This realization can feel unsettling. It can even feel like something has been taken from you. But the Stoics saw this moment differently. They saw it as the beginning of clarity. The philosopher Epictetus spent much of his life teaching people to prepare for this realization. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 11, he explains that suffering grows when we insist that reality must follow our preferences. According to him, the first step toward wisdom is accepting that events will unfold according to their own nature, not according to our wishes. Think about the weight of that idea. Most people spend years arguing with reality in their own minds. They replay events that should not have happened. They resent outcomes they believe were unfair. They exhaust themselves asking why life did not respect their expectations. But reality never participates in that argument. The event has already occurred. The world has already moved forward. Only the mind continues resisting. When you finally see this clearly, something important begins to change. You stop asking why the world refuses to cooperate with your expectations. You begin asking whether those expectations were ever reasonable to begin with. This is the day the illusion breaks. Not the illusion that life contains meaning, but the illusion that life will protect you from hardship. The Stoics believed this realization is not tragic. It is necessary, because as long as you expect the world to behave according to your emotional comfort, you will remain fragile. Every disappointment will feel like a personal attack. Every unexpected outcome will feel like injustice. But when you accept that life has its own structure, independent of your wishes, something remarkable happens. You stop measuring events by whether they please you. You begin measuring them by how you respond to them. This small shift changes the entire center of gravity in your life. Instead of looking outward for stability, you begin looking inward. Instead of demanding fairness from the world, you begin building strength within yourself. But there is still another hidden layer of illusion that traps most people. Even after they accept that life is unpredictable, they continue believing something else without realizing it. They believe the world has silently promised them certain conditions: fair treatment, predictable outcomes, cooperation from others, a kind of invisible agreement between themselves and reality. And when that agreement is broken, the mind reacts with anger, anxiety, or despair. The next step in this journey is recognizing that this agreement never actually existed. Most people move through life believing the world has signed a quiet agreement with them. No one ever speaks about this agreement directly. It is not written anywhere, yet it shapes the way people interpret almost everything that happens to them. Somewhere deep in the mind, a set of expectations forms. If I work hard, things should go well. If I treat people well, they should treat me the same. If I plan carefully, the future should respect those plans. These expectations feel reasonable. They even feel fair. But they hide a dangerous assumption. The assumption that reality has accepted these terms. Think about how often frustration appears in everyday life: a delayed message, a missed opportunity, someone behaving in a way you did not expect. The reaction is rarely neutral. Instead, the mind immediately protests. This should not have happened. They should not behave this way. Things were supposed to go differently. Notice the language hidden inside these thoughts. The word should appears again and again. But where does that word come from? Who decided how reality should behave? The Stoic philosopher Epictetus warned that the mind often creates invisible rules for the world, and then becomes angry when the world refuses to obey them. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, chapter 8, he advises something radical. Do not demand that events happen as you wish. Instead, wish for them to happen as they actually do happen. At first, this sounds passive, but look more closely. It is not an invitation to weakness. It is an invitation to clarity, because every time the mind says this should not be happening, it is secretly arguing with reality itself. And reality never loses that argument. The event has already unfolded. The situation already exists. The only place the conflict continues is inside your own mind. This is why so many people feel exhausted even when nothing dramatic is happening. They are constantly negotiating with the world. They negotiate with the past, wishing it had unfolded differently. They negotiate with the present, demanding it behave more fairly. They negotiate with the future, hoping it will reward their effort exactly as they imagine. But the world never signed this contract. It never promised fairness. It never promised cooperation. It never promised that effort would always produce the outcome you expect. This does not mean effort is meaningless. It means effort belongs to you, but outcomes belong to the world. Once this becomes clear, a heavy burden begins to lift. You stop measuring every event by how closely it follows your expectations. You begin observing reality as it actually is. The behavior of other people becomes easier to understand, because you no longer assume they must follow your values. Uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate because you no longer demand that the future reveal itself in advance. This is the quiet power of withdrawing the invisible contract you once believed existed. The world no longer owes you predictable outcomes, and strangely, this realization makes life easier to face. Because when expectations disappear, events lose their ability to shock you. You begin to move through life with clearer eyes. But even after recognizing this illusion, another problem still remains. Even when people stop expecting the world to obey them, they often remain enslaved by something else: their own reactions. A message can disturb them for hours. A comment can ruin an entire day. A small failure can collapse their confidence. The world may not control them directly, but their emotions still do. Understanding this next layer is essential, because freedom does not begin when the world changes. It begins when your reactions stop controlling your life. Look carefully at how most people lose control of their lives. It rarely happens through dramatic events. There is no single catastrophe that suddenly takes away their freedom. Instead, control disappears slowly through something far more subtle. Their reactions begin to rule them. A message arrives and the mood changes instantly. A criticism appears and confidence collapses. A delay happens and irritation spreads through the entire day. Small events begin to dictate emotional weather. One moment calm, the next moment anxious. One moment confident, the next moment doubtful. The mind moves like a boat pushed by every wave that passes. This is the condition the Stoics warned about. A person who cannot govern their reactions does not truly govern their life. It may feel as if external events are the source of the disturbance, but the Stoic philosophers insisted that something deeper is happening. The disturbance is not in the event. The disturbance is in the interpretation. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly while writing to himself during times of war and uncertainty. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47, he reminds himself that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. That estimate belongs to you. Pause and consider what that means. If someone speaks harshly to you, the words exist for a moment, and then disappear into the past. Yet the mind often continues carrying them long after the event has ended. It replays the conversation. It constructs imagined meanings. It builds new fears around what might happen next. The original event may last seconds, but the interpretation can last hours or even days. This is how emotional servitude begins. The mind reacts instantly, without examination, without distance. Every impulse becomes an order. Every emotion becomes a command. Anger demands retaliation. Fear demands avoidance. Anxiety demands endless prediction about the future. And because these commands feel urgent, most people obey them without question. But the Stoics believed that a human being possesses a faculty that stands above these impulses: reason. Reason creates a small but powerful space between event and reaction. Inside that space, the mind can ask a different question. Is this event truly as important as my emotions suggest? Most of the time, the answer is no. Yet people rarely pause long enough to discover that. They react immediately, and the reaction becomes the story of their day. The philosopher Epictetus explained this with remarkable clarity. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, chapter 5, he wrote that it is not things themselves that disturb people, but the judgments they form about those things. That sentence reveals something uncomfortable but powerful. Many of the emotional storms people experience are self-created, not intentionally, not consciously, but through unexamined judgments that rush into the mind before reason has time to intervene. When you begin to see this process clearly, a new possibility appears. The possibility of interrupting the chain. Event appears. Emotion rises. But before reaction takes control, reason enters the room. That moment of pause is where freedom begins. Not freedom from difficulty. The world will still deliver challenges, but freedom from automatic emotional obedience. And once you experience that pause even once, you begin to realize something important. You are not as powerless as your emotions once made you believe. There is a faculty inside you capable of observing, evaluating, and choosing a response. The Stoics believed that this faculty is the true ruler of a human life. But to use it properly, you must first recognize a boundary that most people never clearly see. A boundary that separates what truly belongs to you from what never did. There is a moment in the development of a disciplined mind when something subtle but powerful happens. The mind begins to slow down, not because the world has become calmer. The world remains exactly as unpredictable as before. Messages still arrive, plans still change, people still behave according to their own nature. But something different enters the situation. Reason. For most people, events and reactions are almost the same thing. Something happens and the emotion follows immediately, as if there were no distance between the two. A harsh comment appears and anger answers instantly. An uncertain outcome appears and anxiety rushes in to fill the silence. A mistake happens and self-judgment begins without hesitation. The reaction feels automatic, almost unavoidable. But the Stoic philosophers believe this apparent inevitability is an illusion. Between the event and the reaction, there is always a moment of interpretation. A silent judgment forms inside the mind. It evaluates what happened. It decides whether the situation is threatening, humiliating, unfair, or dangerous. Only after this judgment forms does the emotion fully take control. This is where reason becomes essential. The philosopher Epictetus devoted much of his teaching to this precise moment. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18, he explains that when an impression first appears in the mind, we must not accept it immediately as truth. Instead, we should pause and examine it. He advises his students to say to every disturbing impression, "You are only an appearance, not necessarily the reality you claim to be." That simple discipline creates distance. Instead of immediately believing what the mind suggests, you begin observing it. The thought says this situation is unbearable. Reason asks, is that actually true? The thought says this failure defines you. Reason asks what evidence supports that conclusion. The thought says everything is collapsing. Reason asks whether the event truly deserves such a dramatic interpretation. This practice does not eliminate emotion. The Stoics never tried to turn human beings into cold statues. Emotions will always arise. They are part of human nature. But reason determines whether those emotions will dominate your actions. When reason enters the room, the mind becomes a place of examination rather than automatic reaction. Instead of being dragged by every emotional impulse, you begin questioning the authority of those impulses. Is this anger useful? Is this fear justified? Is this anxiety helping me act wisely? Many times, the answer will surprise you. What once felt overwhelming often becomes manageable when examined calmly. This is the quiet beginning of self-mastery, because a person who can examine their impressions no longer lives at the mercy of every passing emotion. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this discipline repeatedly while writing in his private reflections. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he tells himself that if something external troubles you, the disturbance comes not from the thing itself, but from your own judgment about it, and that judgment can be erased immediately. Notice the confidence in that statement. The power to change the judgment exists in the same mind that created it. But to exercise that power consistently, the Stoics insisted that a person must recognize a deeper truth about life. Not everything in this world belongs to you. Not every outcome is yours to command. Not every event is yours to shape. Understanding this boundary clearly becomes the next step toward real freedom. There is a boundary in life that most people sense but rarely define. They feel its consequences every day. They experience frustration, anxiety, anger, and exhaustion. Yet the real cause remains hidden because the boundary itself has never been clearly drawn in their minds. The Stoic philosophers insisted that understanding this boundary changes everything. It divides life into two domains: what belongs to you and what does not. The philosopher Epictetus began one of the most important Stoic texts with this exact distinction. In Enchiridion of Epictetus, Chapter 1, he writes that some things are within our power, and some things are not. Within our power are our judgments, our choices, our desires, our actions. Outside our power are the body, reputation, property, and the actions of others. At first glance, this division appears simple, but when you begin applying it honestly, it forces a radical shift in how you understand life. Most people invest enormous emotional energy into things that do not belong to them. They try to control how others perceive them. They try to control how events unfold. They try to control outcomes that depend on countless forces beyond their influence. And when those outcomes refuse to obey their effort, frustration appears. The mind begins to protest. I worked hard for this. This should have gone differently. People should recognize what I have done. But the Stoics would ask a different question. Did you control the effort or did you control the outcome? The effort belongs to you. The outcome never did. Think carefully about how much emotional suffering is created by confusing these two things. A person gives their best effort in a project but becomes distressed because recognition does not follow. Another person behaves with honesty but becomes bitter because others respond with indifference. In both cases, the individual fulfilled what belonged to them. But they also tried to claim ownership over something that never belonged to them. The reaction of others, the direction of events, the final result. The Stoics saw this confusion as the root of much unnecessary pain. When the mind tries to command what lies outside its authority, it enters a permanent state of conflict with reality. Reality continues moving according to its own nature. The mind continues demanding that it behave differently. That conflict creates exhaustion. But when the boundary becomes clear, the mind begins to conserve its strength. You stop chasing control where none exists. Instead, you focus on the one domain that always remains within reach: your judgment, your intention, your action in the present moment. This shift produces an unexpected kind of calm. The future becomes less frightening because you no longer expect to dominate it. Other people become less threatening because you no longer believe their behavior defines your worth. Events lose much of their emotional power because they no longer determine your sense of stability. The Stoics did not teach this idea to make people passive. On the contrary, they believed it produces stronger action. When your energy is no longer wasted trying to control outcomes, You can invest it fully in what truly belongs to you: your conduct, your discipline, your character. This is the beginning of personal power in the Stoic sense. Not power over circumstances. Power over the one thing that remains yours in every situation: your response. But once you see this boundary clearly, another realization follows. Much of the suffering people experience comes from a habit they rarely question: the habit of demanding that the world satisfy their emotional expectations. Letting go of those demands becomes the next step toward freedom. Once you understand the boundary between what belongs to you and what does not, another habit begins to reveal itself. A quiet habit that has shaped much of your emotional life: the habit of making demands. Not demands spoken out loud, but silent ones the mind places on the world every day. Life should be easier than this. People should behave more reasonably. Things should go according to the effort I put in. These thoughts feel natural because they appear in the language of fairness. But fairness is not a law that governs reality. The Stoics understood that much of human frustration comes from expecting the world to deliver emotional comfort. When it does not, the mind reacts with resistance. It argues with events. It resents people. It keeps repeating the same quiet complaint: this should not be happening. But the event is already happening. The moment has already arrived. The only thing still resisting is the mind. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about this pattern of resistance. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 107, he advises that a wise person adapts themselves to circumstances instead of demanding that circumstances adapt to them. That sentence contains a difficult truth. Most people spend enormous emotional energy trying to force reality into the shape they prefer. They want events to cooperate with their plans. They want other people to behave according to their expectations. They want the future to reward their effort with certainty. But life rarely offers such cooperation. The Stoics saw this clearly. They observed that the person who demands comfort from the world will live in constant disappointment, not because the world is hostile, but because it simply follows its own course. Storms appear. Opportunities disappear. People act according to their own motives, not according to your wishes. When the mind continues demanding that reality behave differently, it becomes trapped in endless tension. But something remarkable happens when you withdraw those demands. The mind begins to relax its grip on how things should be. You stop insisting that every moment be pleasant. You stop insisting that every effort produce visible reward. You stop insisting that people behave according to your personal standards. This does not mean you stop valuing discipline, fairness, or wisdom. It means you stop expecting the world to guarantee those values for you. Instead, you carry those values yourself. You act with integrity whether recognition follows or not. You remain steady whether circumstances cooperate or not. You do what is right because it belongs to your character, not because the world has promised to reward you. The Stoics believed this shift transforms the way a person experiences life. Events no longer feel like personal insults. Difficulties no longer feel like violations of some imagined agreement. They become what they always were: situations, neutral material presented by reality. And once events are seen as neutral material, a new freedom appears. You no longer waste energy resisting the existence of the moment. You begin asking a far more useful question. Given that this situation exists, what is the most rational response available to me now? But answering that question requires another discipline, a discipline that changes how the mind interprets what it sees. Because most emotional chaos does not begin in the event itself. It begins in the way the mind chooses to describe the event. Learning to see clearly becomes the next step. Most disturbances in the mind begin long before any emotion becomes visible. They begin in the way the mind describes what it sees. Two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different emotional experiences. One leaves angry or anxious. The other remains calm and focused. The event is identical. What changes is the interpretation. The Stoics believe that learning to see clearly is one of the most important disciplines a person can practice. Without this discipline, the mind exaggerates, dramatizes, and distorts events until they appear far more threatening than they truly are. A small mistake becomes a disaster. A criticism becomes an attack. An uncertain future becomes a looming catastrophe. The imagination expands the event until the mind feels surrounded by problems. But the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to resist this habit. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 49, he writes that you must strip away the story you tell yourself about an event and examine the event itself. When you do this, something surprising often happens. The event becomes much smaller. What once appeared overwhelming becomes manageable when you remove the dramatic interpretation surrounding it. Imagine receiving criticism at work. The mind might immediately interpret it as humiliation, rejection, or proof of personal failure. That interpretation can trigger hours of anger or anxiety. But if you strip away the interpretation and examine only the fact, the event becomes simple. Someone expressed a judgment about your work. That is the event. Everything else was added by the imagination. The same principle applies to uncertainty. When the future is unknown, the mind often fills the empty space with negative predictions. It imagines failure, embarrassment, loss, and regret long before any of those things exist. In reality, the future has not yet arrived. The mind created the entire disturbance in advance. This is why the Stoics insisted that perception must be trained. Not because the world is harmless, but because the untrained mind creates dangers that do not actually exist. When perception becomes disciplined, the mind learns to describe events in their simplest form. A difficulty becomes a challenge rather than a catastrophe. A delay becomes a temporary obstacle rather than proof that everything is collapsing. A criticism becomes information rather than humiliation. This shift may appear small, but its effects are enormous. The mind stops feeding its own fear. Instead of amplifying problems, it begins examining them. And when problems are examined calmly, solutions often become visible. The Stoics practiced this discipline constantly. They reminded themselves that events are neutral until the mind assigns them meaning. If the meaning creates unnecessary suffering, it can be revised. If the interpretation exaggerates the threat, it can be corrected. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means seeing reality without distortion. Once you begin practicing this discipline, emotional chaos loses much of its power. The mind no longer reacts to imagined dangers. It responds only to what truly exists. And when you see reality clearly enough, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Life contains events that cannot be prevented. Obstacles will appear. Loss will occur. Circumstances will change without asking for permission. At that point, a deeper question emerges. How should a rational mind relate to the parts of life that cannot be avoided? The Stoics answered this question with one of their most demanding ideas: acceptance of fate. Once the mind learns to see events clearly, another realization slowly begins to emerge. Some things in life cannot be negotiated. You can prepare, plan, and act with discipline, but certain events will still arrive without asking for permission. Loss appears. Opportunities disappear. Circumstances change direction in ways no one could have predicted. Most people respond to these moments with resistance. They ask why this had to happen. They replay the situation again and again, imagining how it could have unfolded differently. They argue with reality long after the event has already become part of the past. This resistance creates a second layer of suffering. The first layer comes from the event itself. The second comes from the mind refusing to accept that the event exists. The Stoic philosophers believed that this second layer is often more painful than the first, because when the mind refuses to accept reality, it becomes trapped in a struggle it cannot win. Reality has already taken its course. The only thing left resisting is the mind. The Roman philosopher Seneca spoke about this with striking clarity. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 107, he wrote that fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling. Think about the image behind that sentence. Life moves forward whether you cooperate with it or not. If you accept what happens and respond with reason, You walk beside events with dignity. If you resist every difficulty, you are pulled forward in frustration and exhaustion. The Stoics did not interpret acceptance as surrender. They saw it as alignment. The universe has its own structure. Events unfold according to countless causes that extend far beyond any single person's control. Fighting this structure wastes energy. Accepting it allows you to work within it. This is why the Stoics developed the idea often described as loving fate. Not because every event is pleasant, but because every event becomes material for character. A setback becomes training in patience. A loss becomes training in resilience. An obstacle becomes training in creativity and courage. Instead of asking why this happened to me, the Stoic mind asks a different question. Now that this has happened, how can I respond with virtue? This question transforms adversity. The event remains the same, but its role changes. It is no longer an enemy. It becomes a test. And every test offers the opportunity to practice discipline, courage, or wisdom. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this perspective many times while governing an empire filled with uncertainty. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, paragraph 20, he writes that the obstacle standing in the path becomes the path itself. This sentence contains the essence of Stoic resilience. Difficulties are not interruptions of life. They are part of life's design. When you accept this, your relationship with hardship changes. You stop asking for a life without challenges. You begin asking whether you are responding to challenges with strength. And when the mind reaches this point, another realization becomes possible. If events themselves cannot destroy your character, then your character must depend on something else entirely. Not on circumstances, not on approval, but on the way you govern yourself. This leads to the next discipline the Stoics considered essential: self-government. When people speak about power, they usually imagine influence over the outside world. They imagine wealth, authority, reputation, the ability to direct the actions of others. From a distance, these things appear to represent strength. They look like control. But the Stoic philosophers observed something different. They saw powerful leaders who were ruled by anger. They saw wealthy individuals enslaved by fear of losing what they owned. They saw respected figures collapsing under the weight of public opinion. From the Stoic perspective, none of these people were truly powerful, because the first form of power a human being must master is the power over themselves. The Roman philosopher Seneca returned to this idea constantly in his writings. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 37, he wrote that no man is free who is not master of himself. This statement forces a difficult reflection. How many people live under the command of their impulses? Anger decides their words. Fear decides their choices. Comfort decides their discipline. When emotions rule this way, a person may appear successful on the outside, but internally, they remain unstable. Their mood rises and falls with every circumstance. Their confidence depends on praise. Their motivation depends on convenience. Their peace depends on the cooperation of the world. This is not freedom. It is dependency disguised as normal life. The Stoics believed that a human being possesses a higher faculty capable of establishing order within this chaos. Reason. Reason examines impulses before they become actions. It evaluates whether a reaction serves virtue or merely satisfies emotion. Instead of asking, "What do I feel like doing?" the Stoic mind asks, "What is the most rational action available right now?" Sometimes the answer requires restraint, holding back anger when retaliation would be easy. Sometimes the answer requires courage, speaking truth when silence would be safer. Sometimes the answer requires discipline, acting with consistency even when motivation has disappeared. Every time a person chooses reason over impulse, a small act of self-government occurs. At first, these acts feel difficult because the mind has spent years obeying emotion without question. But with practice, something begins to change. The impulses lose their authority. They still appear, but they no longer command automatic obedience. The mind becomes a place of leadership rather than reaction. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of this responsibility while leading the Roman Empire. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, he wrote that the mind should remain like a fortress that no external force can capture unless the gate is opened from within. That image reveals the essence of Stoic sovereignty. External events may surround you. Difficult people may challenge you. Uncertainty may appear in every direction. But the authority to interpret those events remains inside your own mind. If you govern that authority wisely, no circumstance can fully enslave you. This is why the Stoics considered character the highest form of strength. Because character is the result of repeated decisions to govern oneself with reason. And once a person begins practicing this discipline, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Many people delay the development of this strength because they are waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right mood, waiting for some future version of themselves to finally begin. But the Stoics had little patience for this habit, because the habit of waiting quietly steals years from a person's life. Understanding why becomes the next step in this journey. Look carefully at how many important decisions in life are postponed. Not because they are impossible, but because the mind believes the moment is not yet right. People tell themselves they will begin when they feel more confident. They will take action when motivation returns. They will commit to discipline once life becomes less complicated. So the plan is always delayed until some future moment that seems more convenient. But that moment rarely arrives. The future appears, and it carries the same uncertainty the present already had. New difficulties replace the old ones. New responsibilities appear. New doubts rise in the mind. And once again the mind says the same sentence. Not yet. This is how years quietly disappear. The Stoic philosophers warned their students about this habit because they understood something most people ignore. Life does not wait for psychological readiness. Time moves forward, whether you feel prepared or not. Opportunities appear and disappear according to their own rhythm. The world continues changing without asking whether you have organized your intentions. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote with urgency about this problem. In On the Shortness of Life by Seneca, Chapter 1, he explains that life is long enough to accomplish remarkable things if it is used properly, but most of it is lost through hesitation, distraction, and postponement. He observed that people guard their money carefully, but treat their time with astonishing carelessness. They allow entire years to dissolve while waiting for a better mood or a clearer future. But discipline does not grow from waiting. It grows from action. The Stoics believe that the present moment always contains something within your control. A choice can be made. An effort can be started. A principle can be practiced. You may not control the outcome of that effort, but you always control whether the effort begins. This is why Stoic philosophy places such importance on immediate action guided by reason. If a task is worthy, begin it. If a habit strengthens your character, practice it now. If a truth must be spoken, speak it with clarity rather than postponing it for a more comfortable moment. The mind often creates elaborate explanations for delay. It says the conditions are not perfect. It says more preparation is needed. It says the future will offer a better opportunity. But when you examine these explanations closely, they often hide something simpler. Fear. Fear of failure. Fear of judgment. Fear of discovering that the path will be more difficult than imagined. Waiting appears safer, yet waiting slowly weakens the will. Because every time action is postponed, the mind learns that intention can exist without commitment. The Stoics refused to allow this separation. For them, intention without action was merely a pleasant idea. Character was built through decisions that translated intention into behavior. When a person begins acting according to principle instead of waiting for comfort, a new kind of strength develops. Confidence begins to grow not from predictions about the future, but from evidence gathered in the present. You become someone who acts. And once that habit takes root, another surprising discovery follows. Many of the fears that once seemed overwhelming begin to shrink when faced directly. What once appeared unbearable becomes manageable. In fact, the Stoics believed that deliberately facing certain forms of difficulty can make a person stronger. Not accidentally, intentionally. Understanding why leads to the next discipline they practiced: Type 1 to write the next topic or type the changes you want. Most people spend a great deal of their energy trying to avoid discomfort. They organize their lives around convenience. They look for the smoothest path, the easiest conditions, the least resistance possible. At first, this appears sensible. Comfort feels like safety. But the Stoic philosophers observed a hidden cost in this habit. A life organized entirely around comfort produces a fragile mind. When difficulty finally appears, the person feels overwhelmed because they have spent years avoiding the very experiences that build resilience. The Roman philosopher Seneca addressed this directly. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, letter 18, he advised practicing voluntary discomfort from time to time. He suggested deliberately living with less luxury for short periods, eating simple food, wearing ordinary clothing, and reminding oneself that hardship is survivable. His purpose was not punishment. His purpose was training. Seneca believed that when a person occasionally experiences difficulty by choice, the mind learns something important. The things it once feared are not as terrifying as imagination suggested. Think about how fear operates in the mind. It often grows strongest around experiences that remain unfamiliar. The unknown appears larger than life because it has never been examined directly. But when you face discomfort voluntarily, the mystery disappears. Cold becomes simply cold. Fatigue becomes simply fatigue. Effort becomes simply effort. None of these experiences destroy you. They test you, and every time you pass through that test, the mind becomes more confident in its ability to endure difficulty. The Stoics saw this as a form of mental conditioning. If a person never practices resilience during calm moments, they will struggle to find resilience during difficult ones. But if the mind becomes accustomed to controlled hardship, unexpected challenges no longer appear overwhelming. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius faced this reality constantly while leading the Roman Empire through wars and political instability. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 10, paragraph 8, he reminds himself that difficulty is not a signal to retreat, but an opportunity to practice the virtues he values. Every obstacle becomes a moment to exercise patience. Every frustration becomes a moment to exercise discipline. Every setback becomes a moment to exercise courage. Seen this way, hardship changes its role. It is no longer an enemy that must always be avoided. It becomes a training ground. The mind begins to welcome challenges as opportunities to prove its strength. And as this mindset develops, a remarkable transformation occurs. Situations that once produced anxiety begin to produce calm focus instead. You no longer panic when conditions become difficult. You recognize the moment as familiar territory, a place where character can be tested and strengthened. This is one of the reasons Stoic philosophy produced individuals capable of remarkable composure during crisis. They had trained their minds to endure discomfort long before the crisis arrived. But all of this training leads towards something deeper than resilience alone. It leads toward the construction of an inner structure that remains stable even when the outside world becomes chaotic. The Stoics described this structure with a powerful image: an inner citadel. After a person spends time practicing discipline, examining their judgments and facing discomfort with reason, something quiet begins to take shape inside them. At first, it is barely noticeable. They react less impulsively than before. They pause more often before speaking. They feel less shaken by events that once disturbed them deeply. These small changes are not accidents. They are the first signs that the mind is building something solid within itself. The Stoic philosophers often described this inner stability as a fortress of the mind, a place inside a person that remains steady, even when everything outside becomes uncertain. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius reflected on this idea many times while writing his private notes. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 48, he reminds himself that the mind can withdraw into itself and find calm whenever it chooses. This does not mean escaping reality. It means remembering where your true authority exists. External conditions will always change. Markets rise and fall. Reputation shifts with the opinions of others. Relationships evolve in ways you cannot fully control. If your peace depends entirely on these things, your emotional life will always remain unstable. Every shift in circumstance will feel like a threat. But when the mind builds an inner foundation based on reason and character, stability becomes possible even in an unpredictable world. The Stoics believed this inner citadel is constructed through repeated acts of self-government. Each time you choose patience instead of anger, a stone is placed in that structure. Each time you accept reality instead of resisting it, another stone is added. Each time you act according to principle rather than convenience, the walls become stronger. Over time, the mind begins to trust its own structure. You stop depending on the approval of others to feel secure. You stop needing circumstances to remain comfortable in order to remain calm. The source of stability moves inward. This does not mean the Stoics rejected relationships, success, or external achievements. They simply refused to treat those things as the foundation of peace. Because anything that can be taken away by chance cannot be the true center of a human life. The philosopher Epictetus spoke about this with remarkable clarity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 4, Chapter 1, he explains that a person who anchors their well-being in things outside their control becomes vulnerable to constant disturbance. But the person who anchors their well-being in their own character becomes difficult to shake. This is the purpose of the inner citadel. It is not a place of isolation. It is a place of clarity. From this place, the mind observes events without panic. It evaluates challenges without exaggeration. It chooses responses according to reason rather than impulse. And when a person begins living from this inner structure, something important becomes visible. The world has not become easier. People still behave unpredictably. Circumstances still change. Uncertainty still exists. But the person facing those realities is no longer the same. They walk through the same world with a different kind of calm. Understanding how that calm operates in everyday life becomes the next step. Once the mind develops this inner stability, the world begins to look different. The events themselves have not changed. The same uncertainties exist. People still behave according to their own nature. Situations still appear that no one could have predicted. But the way you move through those situations becomes calmer. Where the untrained mind sees chaos, the disciplined mind sees conditions that require judgment. This is one of the quiet transformations Stoic philosophy produces. Life stops feeling like a series of emotional shocks and begins to feel like a series of situations that call for character. A delay appears. Instead of frustration immediately taking control, the mind pauses and asks what can be done within this moment. A criticism appears. Instead of reacting defensively, the mind examines whether there is truth inside the criticism that can be used for improvement. An uncertain future appears. Instead of imagining catastrophe, the mind focuses on what can be prepared today. This change does not eliminate difficulty. It changes the posture with which difficulty is faced. The Stoic philosophers believed that the person who practices this posture becomes difficult to destabilize, not because they are indifferent to life, but because they have learned where their attention belongs, on their own conduct. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about this mindset while managing an empire filled with unpredictable events. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 54, he reminds himself that the task of a human being is simple: to do what is right in the present moment and accept what the present moment brings. Notice how practical this perspective is. It does not require perfect conditions. It does not require certainty about the future. It requires only that you act with reason and integrity within the situation that currently exists. This approach removes a great deal of mental noise. Instead of worrying endlessly about possibilities that may never occur, the mind returns to the present. What can be done now? What action reflects discipline now? What response reflects courage now? When attention returns to the present moment in this way, anxiety loses much of its influence. The future stops appearing as a looming threat. It becomes simply the next moment that will arrive, just like every moment before it. And when that moment arrives, the same principle applies. Examine the situation clearly. Act according to reason. Accept what lies outside your control. This rhythm creates a steady way of living. You move from moment to moment with clarity rather than fear. You respond to challenges with thought rather than impulse. You remain stable even while conditions around you continue to change. This is what it means to walk through an uncertain world with calm. And when a person reaches this point, the original idea that began this entire reflection reveals its deeper meaning. The idea that no one is coming to save you. At first, that sentence sounded harsh, but now its real message becomes clear. It was never meant to frighten you. It was meant to free you. Understanding that freedom becomes the final step. At the beginning, the idea sounded severe. No one will save you. Most people hear that sentence and immediately feel resistance. It seems cold, almost merciless, as if it removes hope rather than offering it. But now, after everything you have seen, the meaning begins to change. Because the Stoics never meant that you are abandoned. They meant something far more empowering. They meant that the authority over your mind has always belonged to you. The world will continue moving according to its own nature. People will continue acting according to their own character. Some will be fair, others will not. Some will understand you, others will misunderstand you completely. Events will arrive that you did not plan. Opportunities will appear when you least expect them. Difficulties will appear when life seems most stable. This uncertainty is not a flaw in life. It is the structure of life. The Stoics never promised a world without these conditions. Instead, they offered a different promise, that a human being can remain steady within them. The philosopher Epictetus expressed this idea with striking simplicity. In Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 25, he explains that the true task of a human being is not to arrange external events, but to arrange their own judgments about those events. When judgments are disciplined, the mind becomes difficult to disturb. The Roman philosopher Seneca described this inner freedom in another way. In Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 71, he wrote that the wise person is content with themselves because they carry their peace within them. This is the final lesson hidden inside the sentence that began our journey. No one will save you, because no one needs to. The rescue people spend their lives waiting for was never meant to come from outside. It was always meant to come from clarity. Clarity about what belongs to you, your judgments, your choices, your actions. Clarity about what never belonged to you, outcomes, the opinions of others, the unpredictable movements of life. Once this distinction becomes real in your mind, a quiet transformation takes place. You stop waiting for life to stabilize before you allow yourself to feel calm. You stop asking circumstances for permission to live with courage. You stop searching for external guarantees before acting with discipline. Instead, you begin living according to principles that cannot be taken away by chance. Reason guides your decisions. Discipline shapes your habits. Courage supports your actions when uncertainty appears. Peace becomes the result of alignment rather than the reward of good luck. The world remains uncertain. But you are no longer waiting for certainty. You are building strength. And once a person understands this, they stop asking when life will finally become easy. They begin asking a far more powerful question. Given the reality in front of me right now, what is the most virtuous action I can take? That question is the true beginning of Stoic freedom. Because the moment you stop waiting for rescue and start governing your own mind, something remarkable becomes clear. You were never powerless. You were only waiting, and now you no longer need to.